Hey everyone, this is Carrie with Canary Quilts, and I wanted to show you this Friday's freebie. I did a Cricut and quilt mashup. I created this little trick-or-treat design on Cricut Design Space, and you put it on some HTV, ironed it onto the center panel, added some half square triangles to the top and bottom, and I got myself a cute little Halloween quilt. The following video will show you how to put this together, and the pattern is available on my website at canaryquilts.com in my free pattern resource library. I hope you enjoy the video, and I look forward to seeing what you make. Thank you. Okay, to start this quilt, here are the materials that I have laid out. I've got my 2 strips of fabric, my squares for making the half square triangles. This is the centerpiece where the heat transfer vinyl is going to be put on. And here's my binding. I've got my scissors, I've got a ruler, my rotary cutter, and then this is the heat transfer vinyl for my Cricut. And I've got my clips over here to hold everything together as I'm working. So I've got this pattern in my free resource library on my website, which I'll put a link to below so you can get all the measurements and the pattern for the heat transfer vinyl. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to put this together as a little Cricut quilt. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut my heat transfer vinyl on my Cricut. And you can get the pattern to cut this out on my website. I've got the link below to download this pattern, so you can also cut it out on your Cricut. And then once I get this cut out, I'm going to weed it, and then I'm going to iron it onto this piece. So I'm going to go get this cut out on my Cricut. So the Cricut settings I'm using is for everyday iron on, and I have the pressure set at more. And then I'm just going to hit my Cricut button and start. Okay, so while I'm waiting for my pattern to print out on the Cricut, I'm going to take my centerpiece where we're going to be putting the heat transfer vinyl on. And since we use 1/4 inch seams in our quilting, I'm going to mark with my friction pen, which will disappear with heat. I'm going to mark a 1/4 inch line so that when I put my heat transfer vinyl, it will be on that line, so I don't sew into it. So there I've got a 1/4 inch, and that's where I'm going to line up the bottom of my heat transfer vinyl before I fuse it on. Okay, now that we have weeded our pattern out, I'm going to take the bottom of this and line it up with that 1/4 inch line that I drew before on my material, so that the heat transfer vinyl will be a 1/4 of an inch up in, I won't catch it in my seam. I shouldn't catch it in my seam. So now I'm going to take this over to my iron, and we're going to get this ironed down per the instructions of the heat transfer vinyl. There it is, now that I've transferred it over, and oh my gosh, is that so adorable. I just love these little trick-or-treating patterns. And I'm making 3 quilts, 3 little mini quilts, and they're all going to have 3 different trick-or-treating patterns. And like I said, you can find that these patterns over on my website under our resource library. Okay, now that I've got this on, I'm going to start working on the half square triangles that are going to go up here and down here. So here's my half square triangles, or my squares to make my half square triangles. And I'm going to layer a dark and a light. I'm going to take my little ruler and I'm going to draw a diagonal line down from one corner to the other with my friction pen, because this will erase with under heat. So I'm going to do this with all 6 of these, and then when I get over to my machine, I'm going to use my 1/4 inch foot and sew a 1/4 inch seam on either side of this center line. So now I'm set up over at my machine and I've got my 1/4 inch foot attached, and here's my red line that I drew over at my sewing table. So I am going to set the 1/4 inch part of this foot on that red line so that when I sew, I will create a seam that is a 1/4 of an inch off that, and I'm going to do it on both sides of the red line. There we go. And then we'll just cut down this line and we've got 2 of our half square triangles that are going to look just like that. So now I've got my squares of half square triangles all pressed out towards the dark side. So what I'm going to do now is I ultimately need a 2.5 inch square. So I'm taking this diagonal line on my ruler and lining it up with my seam. And then the 2.5 inch mark is right here in the corner. And then I'm going to trim these up. Flip it and do the exact same thing. Line up that diagonal line on the seam. Make sure 2.5 is right down here in the corner and it lines up on the sides, and then give it a little trimming. And there, we got a 2.5 inch square. So I'm going to get that done to all of my squares now. Okay, we got all our pieces cut to 2.5 inches. So now we can decide how we want to lay our pieces out. So this is how I am going to lay my pieces out. But the fun thing is if you just start turning your pieces, you can get different patterns here. You can go where they all sit the same. That looks kind of cool. Kind of looks like a saw. Teeth to a saw, I guess. But anyway, this is how I'm going to be putting my little quilt together, is with my pieces like this. So I want to start here by marking which seams I need to sew together. So I'm just going to fold these over and pin it. And that's how I know what side I'm going to sew when I'm at the machine. And I'm going to do the same pattern on the top of the little quilt. So I'll have all 6 of my, all 12 of my pieces laid out and ready to go over at the machine. So there we go, get these ready to go. Sew this side. Sew that side. So I'm going to take these over to the machine and I'm going to sew them on these edges at 1/4 of an inch. So I got my squares sewn together and I ironed these open, the seams ironed open. So now what I need to do is do 2 strips sewn together like this. So it's pretty easy. I'm going to take it over my machine, sew it to that side. And then when I get done sewing those two together, I will sew these together. And I will do that for both strips. Okay, I got my rows, my strips done. I've got all my seams ironed out. And now it's time to put this together. So I'm just going to put these two here, or this one here. I'm going to sew it to the bottom edge. And then this one up here is going to get sewn to the top edge. 1/4 inch seam. And then I am going to press my seams away from the center when I'm done sewing. So you're all probably wondering, when I said I was going to iron these seams out, how I was going to do that with vinyl on here. Well, you just have to be real careful. So I'm going to give these a good finger press like this. On either side, and then I'll take you over to the ironing board and show you how I do it. You just have to be mindful where your vinyl and your iron are. So I got a good finger press here and up here, and now I'll get the iron. This top's going to be easy. The bottom's going to be a little more difficult. Okay, got these finger pressed out. And I'm just going to take my iron and I'm going to go over top of what I folded under. I'm going over top of this right here. I'm not touching the vinyl. I'm just kind of skimming that seam. There, that's nice and flat. And then we'll come up over to this one. Make sure I got my seam going up towards the squares. And then this one doesn't have any vinyl near it, so I can kind of just go right over top. Watch out for that tree branch. There we go. Now we have our nice flat seams without touching the vinyl. So to finish off this quilt, we're going to take our strips and we're going to sew them to the top and bottom. And then I will press the seams towards the squares. So I'm going to go get these sewn out. There we go. Got the top and bottom strips put on. Folded them, or I ironed them towards the blocks. Now what I want is, I want this to be a 12.5 inch square. I have a ruler here that's exactly 12.5 inches. And what I am going to do is match these up. The seams there. I'm going to match the seams down here. And since I need a 12.5 inch block, I'm going to cut at 6.25 inches. I'm going to take my ruler, I'm going to put 6.25 inches on my fold. to cut along this edge here. So now we have a 12.5-inch square. So now this little pretty is ready to get some quilt batting, a backing, and some binding. If you have a heat press, you could take a Teflon sheet like this and go over top of the vinyl with your iron. Not a lot, but just lightly go over it to get out any wrinkles that occurred. Yeah, I've got my little quilt sandwiched. I used this quilt basting spray on the back of the quilt top, and it helps it stick and lay flat. And then I did the same thing with my backing. Sprayed it and pushed it flat. So now we're ready to go over and quilt this. I do not quilt over top of any of the vinyl, I just quilt around it. So the first thing I do when I'm over here at the sewing machine before I begin quilting is put a basting stitch all the way around, about 1/8 of an inch on the edge of the top. Okay, I'm all set up on my machine to do some free motion quilting. I've got a sulky rayon 40 weight thread that's variegated in golds that I'm going to be using. And my plan here is in the sunset areas, the batik sunsets here, I'm just going to be going like long back and forth like this to kind of like make it look like clouds in the sky. And I'm going to do that all in between my vinyl here. And then I'm also going to do it on the edges. And then for my squares here, I am only going to stitch in the ditch free motion over the purple. And that's all I'm going to do on this little quilt. Okay, I got all the edges, the extra batting and backing cut off, and I'm going to put the binding on. And I'm going to start on the bottom edge over here towards the corner. I'm going to sew all the way around until I get over to the other corner on the bottom, and I'm going to stop so I can then cut it and put it together. Okay, I'm using a 2.5-inch strip for a binding, and I'm doing that because this is not going to be a show quilt. Nobody's going to see the back of this quilt. I don't want to hand sew the binding, so when I sew it, I want to make sure it gets caught. So that's why I'm making it so big. So I have a 2.5-inch binding. I'm going to put my ruler on the end of this side of the binding, and then I'm going to cut the other side at 2.25 inches, which is 1/4 inch less than the width of my binding. So now I need to put these together and sew them at a diagonal. And then it will end up being straight across, and because I did 1/4 inch, it'll be pretty tight here, so I won't have any buckling. And let's see if I can figure this out, even though I've done it a million times. before I cut it, I check it. So yep, that'll be right. So I'm going to cut this down to 1/4 of an inch and finger press it. Now I can finish sewing it across. Now I'm going to just fold it over and start pinning it. Like I said, this is a big binding, but I don't want to hand sew it, and I want to make sure when I do machine sew it, I do catch it, because nobody, this is going to be hanging in my house. Nobody's going to be seeing the back of this quilt. So when I get a corner here, I'm just folding it over and pinning it like that, so that when I stitch, it'll come right here and cross this, and I'll turn and it'll catch. Okay, I'm going to change my foot away from my 1/4 inch into the standard foot. And I am going to stitch in the ditch right next to the binding seam. Let's start at the bottom. Here's a look at the finished quilt out of the machine. Stitch in the ditch you can't really see, and I used black thread, so if I did hit the binding, you can't see it. And then here's the back. So you see I went extra wide to make sure I hit all of the binding so that I wouldn't have to come back and figure it out. Yeah, it's so cute. I've got 3 of these trick-or-treat sets that I'm going to hang up on my wall.